Seth Duncan. I'm a Group Director of Analytics at WCG. We're an integrated digital communications and marketing agency based out of San Francisco. We have offices across the globe. Today I'm actually going to be talking a little bit, I'm going to be touching on influencer marketing, but I figured given that a lot of you guys are probably Sysomos users or evaluating Sysomos, that many of you are probably in a digital or social media or maybe comms or marketing insights or research kind of function. Is that kind of a safe assumption here for the most part? So I thought I would actually kind of talk specifically about the way that social data and social analytics and the kind of data and information you get from influencer identification and influencer ranking and influencer analytics is kind of transforming market research or marketing research as a whole. I'm specifically talking about cases where you're using sort of digital influence and social media conversation data to actually make decisions that don't have anything to do with social media. Everything from product development to distribution to offline marketing and so on. Why does it take an agency 3 months to answer something that I need within a couple of days? And this is a famous quote from, well, it's a famous in my mind at least, from David Ogilvy. I'm sure most of you guys know him, started kind of a big agency back in the 60s. This is from a book of his called Ogilvy on Advertising. It's kind of a classic in this space. It was written, I think it was published first in 1980. And I don't know how many of you have read it. It's a great read. He's infinitely quotable. In the 4th chapter, he's kind of talking about how to get a gig at an advertising agency. And the chapter kind of goes in stages talking about, like, what do you do if you want to be a planner? And what do you do if you want to be an account executive? And what do you do if you want to be in creative? And the final section is, what do you want to do if you want to be in research? And it's really funny because in the other sections, he's like, oh, it's a great job. You get a lot of respect from your peers. And then when it gets to research, he just basically kind of like goes into like how much researchers suck and what they could be doing better. And one of the things that's really consistent is that researchers and agencies take way too long to actually get the insights that him and his team need to actually go and create campaigns and actually, basically change the way that clients are reaching their market. And it's really kind of funny that this is an issue that I think is still very much true today. I think a dirty secret on the agency side is that until very recently, when you're kind of working on a campaign, either at an ad or a comms or marketing agency, the research and the actual sort of strategic and tactical work are being done in parallel. And for those of you that work at agencies, this is going to be really familiar to you. Basically, both start at the same time, and you use the research if it matches up with the campaign. Like if the campaign and the research match up, you're like, we're going to present this to the client. They're going to love that. But when it doesn't, you just ignore the research, right? I mean, so the point of this all, though, is that I think with, I'm going to kind of talk about how social data is actually kind of being used to revolutionize the way that marketing research, survey research, panel-based research is really being, I guess, done and maybe even replaced in some case to get the kind of insights that used to take 6 months, $500,000, and so on, to do essentially in a matter of days, using tools like Sysomos and APIs and so on. So I think that this will be really helpful for those of you that are trying to make the case to maybe make more of an investment in using social data. Maybe some of you maybe aren't convinced that social data can replace things like surveys, or maybe you've already been kind of bought into this and need some ammunition to kind of support that idea. So that's what I'm going to talk about first, and then I'll get into some case studies of how basically case studies of where we've used social data to replace things like surveys and so on in really quick and efficient ways that led to really great outcomes for some of our clients. And there's definitely some influencer marketing examples in here. So there's really 5 reasons that I see as being 5 big reasons why I think social data is at a place now where you can actually replace traditional marketing research. First is that social media data is representative. I don't know how many of you actually follow the Advertising Research Foundation, but about 2 years ago, Joan Lewis, who's the head of Procter & Gamble's Consumer Marketing Insights team, she gave this really provocative speech about how Procter & Gamble is going to be investing less in survey research moving forward and make more of an investment in using social data. And the first thing everybody said, there was like kind of a huge kind of shitstorm, honestly, where basically people like, people at Keller Fay and so on were like, you can't do that, you can't do that. Social media is not representative. It's like skews way too young, way too far towards like college educated, IT professionals use it. Like, how can that be representative? But actually, I'm thinking that might have been true maybe in 2007, 2008, but I just don't think it's true anymore. Here are some statistics just looking at social network adoption globally. In North America already, 52% of the population, like this isn't 52% of people online, like this is 50% of all adults are actually using a social network. It's wild. I mean, like if if that's not representative or as representative as like a panel that you're essentially using it like not to throw other agencies under the bus like a GFK, then I don't really know what is, honestly. The adoption is even higher in some other places. There's a couple of countries in Asia, for example, where it's quite a bit higher. In Australia, it's actually almost at 50%. I think the key thing is that when you look at who's actually adopting the social networks over time, it's not just the young, the college-educated, and IT professionals. It's actually everybody. I mean, so you could even see like among 65 plus. I mean, yeah, maybe back in like 2009, you might not have wanted to sample social media data to understand like what people of a retirement age are actually thinking about or doing. But nowadays, like 43% of them are actively using social networks. So again, like the whole argument that it's not representative is starting to go away. The other kind of key thing is that if you look across all these demographics, this is actually from a Pew Internet Research study. If you guys want to look at it, just go to like pewresearch.com. You can find, they do great reporting on this kind of stuff, just sort of national trends and media adoption. But the key thing here is that it's like across basically all ages, all education levels, all income levels, basically sort of like locations, like in terms of whether you're living in a suburban environment, a rural one, an urban one, the adoption looks pretty much similar. The only difference you really see is that people between the ages of 18 and 29 are using it a little bit more than people that are 65. But if you look at education, income, and what they call urbanity, it's identical. The adoption rates are exactly the same. So you're not going to, if you do sample a bunch of social media conversations, for example, it's not like you're going to be like overly biased towards people in urban areas, for example. And that's really key. The other really great thing about using social data is that people are now sharing everything. At one point, I think that, well, often people will make the argument that you shouldn't really use social data or social conversations because people are really ego-driven in their sharing, that people only want to share positive experiences or they're really only like using it for bragging. But more and more, we're actually seeing people are just sharing everything that they do. This is a recent study by KPCB where they actually found that 15% of social media users in the United States report sharing everything. That means sharing all their feelings, sharing like what they're eating every day, just really bizarre stuff. And I know that sounds really sort of bizarre to many of us, but I mean, as a social media analytics guy, you see people sharing way too much. Actually, I have a good oversharing example here in a second. Here's another trend that actually I'm seeing that's sort of suggesting that this trend's going to continue. If you actually look at the next generation of consumers, basically teens, they're all reporting that they're sharing really, really private stuff, way more than they even were about 6 years ago. I mean, some of this stuff is really shocking. It's kind of creepy. But basically, I mean, you can know exactly what your audience looks like. You can actually, when you do consumer segmentation using social media data, you can actually show brand teams like literally what does your audience look like because they're posting photos of themselves. That also means that you can do really cool stuff. Like if you pull all the social media conversations around something like the Sysomos Influencer Marketing Summit, you can actually go and look at the pictures and infer demographics based on that. That's something that we do quite a bit using social media data. But obviously there's a lot of great, I mean, you can pull email addresses and actually figure out what other social networks people are on. You can kind of create this social graph of individuals using this data because they're sharing so much. And just from like a kind of content example, they're also sharing a lot of experiences, right? So we do a lot of healthcare work at WCG. This is something we did for a client last year where we were surprised to find, we needed to look at conversations around colonoscopies. We didn't think we were going to find much, but we actually found about 20,000 patient-driven conversations about colonoscopies. And so it's whenever somebody's like, I don't think people are talking about, if you're like, if you have like an enterprise tech company or if you have a B2B company, like I don't think people talk about what my customers will talk about, our work online. It's not true. You'll find conversations about everything. And this is a really, I mean, this woman down here, it's hard to read, but she's actually describing her colonoscopy procedure, saying that it was a lot more comfortable than she expected it to be, and she thanks her doctor, right? I mean, like, it's amazing what people will share. I'm never let down by the rich data that is out there. So the other key thing is that the social data is not just conversational in nature, and this is really, really important because of actually the 1-9-90 rule that we were just talking about. Across categories, we usually see that 1% of the online population is actually creating the content online. That means everything from blog posts to news to video, in some cases images. 9% are essentially resharing it and repackaging it. So they might actually take a news story, retweet it, add a little color commentary, and sort of syndicate it to their friends. But most people are what we call lurkers and learners, and I kind of usually fall into this category, especially in my private life. I don't really spend a lot of time, sharing videos of my family on YouTube, but but I do, look at other content out there. And the kind of consequence of this is that if you just look at social media conversations, a lot of the time you're really just seeing the 1 and maybe the 9%. You're not actually kind of getting the long tail. You're not getting a lot of data around the long tail consumers, or at least that's the assumption. Then it's true, like when you put in a keyword for something, like I know like Visa, I'm just going to pick on you just because you're in the front. But if you want to talk about, I don't know, like interest rates on your credit card, which I know has nothing to do with Visa, has to do with your bank. You might actually just find that only the 1%, the 9% are actually talking about this online. But I think that, if you actually, one of the key consequences of this actually is that a lot of the conversations you find online for consumer stuff especially isn't relevant. So this is actually from an analysis we did of smart water conversations. And I think something like 90% of the conversation wasn't actually driven by people talking about drinking smart water. They were basically giving like really bad jokes or putting bad jokes out there. Things like, they would post on their friend's Facebook wall and say things like, "You're dumb, you need smart water," or, I don't need to study for my exam, I'm going to drink smart water instead. And the interesting thing is that, well, I guess it's not interesting, but the consequences of this is that a brand like Smartwater can't really use these conversational analytics to really drive any sort of insights around their brand, right? This is not their audience. If Smartwater wants to associate itself with things like fitness and wellness, there's no insights here, right? But I think there are other ways of getting that kind of information, because the 90% behaves online, and you can track their behavior, and you can find these traces of their interests. So one of the things you can do is basically everybody shares and sort of watches things. Like they watch videos, they do link to things sometimes when they're using Twitter and Facebook, even if they're not producing the content themselves. So you can kind of look at these behavioral patterns and actually start to see, networks, for example. You can actually start to see clusters of interest. This is looking at parents talking about health and wellness or sharing health and wellness tips. And when it comes to influencer marketing, this is kind of an aside, but this is, is anybody from BlogHer around by any chance? Sort of? Okay, sorry, I'm going to say something slightly negative about BlogHer, but don't tweet it. We actually found that no other influential parent bloggers ever linked the BlogHer network. Like the BlogHer network was completely isolated, and like they all linked to each other, but it was really hard to get like a normal parent to actually go to them for information. Really useful to know, right? But anyway, that wasn't through conversational analytics. That was really just by looking at their behaviors online. Another thing that is sort of interesting, is I think something people forget about, is that everybody shares their interests on their social networks, right? If you actually, this is a study from April showing that on average, most American consumers are sharing, they like at least 70 pages on Facebook. So that means even if they're not talking about your brand, they're at least liking your brand. You can actually go out and see what other brands they might like, and that's something that you can just do just by using the Facebook API or the Twitter API. And I have some case studies of what that actually looks like in a little bit. The other key thing is that device use has completely shifted. I mean, this is the first year where more people are actually walking around with smartphones and tablets than with notebooks and desktops. So what that means is that people aren't just kind of like going home at the end of the day and talking about their events on their blog. They're actually sharing information in real time throughout the day. And so what you can actually do is you can see not just sort of, even if they're not talking, you can see where your customers are like physically. You can go in and see where they're checking in or where they're actually using LBS. This is for a beverage brand that we work with. We were actually able to show them exactly where in Manhattan all of basically their fans online actually go to, even when they're not talking about them. And you can go in and kind of drill in and look at conversational analytics. But this is all stuff you can do just using the Twitter API and the you can actually use Sysomos. You can use the Twitter API. You can use the Foursquare API and so on. It's completely public information. The other key thing, and I guess sort of like the last one that I'll really touch on around why social data is really, is starting to become an effective means of replacing traditional survey and panel-based research is experience sampling. What that means, basically the idea is that if you survey somebody at one point in time and you ask them, for example, what led you to purchase my product, their memories are really not that good. This is, I don't know how many of you ever studied psychology in college, or if you remember this chart. This is something called the serial position effect. Basically, in experiments for the last 40 or 50 years, what you see is that if you give people a list of things, they tend to remember the very first things on the list and the very last things on the list. And that's because there's two different types of memory working here. There's the long-term memory where you rehearse something over and over again, you remember it. And then there's the short-term memory where something just happened to you, so of course you remember it. So this is why, for example, you can remember maybe when you graduated college, or when you first got married, or when you had your first kid, because you've replayed that in your brain a lot. It's very relevant to you. but you probably can't remember what you had for breakfast last Tuesday. It's just not that relevant. You're not rehearsing it very often, and it's a little bit old. So when it comes to sort of introspection on why you bought something, surveys are notoriously horrible at telling you really why they do that. I mean, you don't really remember all the steps you took. But, and I think that Zach touched on a little bit about this earlier, with social data, you can actually take people, you can find when they bought something online or when they mentioned buying something, and go back historically for those people and actually see across the entire customer life journey, like what actually led them, behaviorally and conversationally to that point. So again, social data, I think in many ways is a lot more effective than using, survey and self-report to actually understand what's really motivating customers to take some sort of action. So basically, when you take all of this together, you take the fact that social data is representative, that it's behavioral, that there's a lot of candid information about things like colonoscopies, and you're actually sampling people's behavior and their feelings and their motivations at the point of the experience, not retrospectively. I think that's really powerful. And then I think when you add in the fact that social data, often like collecting, it's either free or it's really cheap, you can kind of automate the analysis in many cases. There's a lot of tools like Sysomos, for example, where you don't need to know anything about Excel or SPSS to kind of get the data you need. And the fact that the data is in real time, so you can make real-time marketing decisions, I think it makes it, well, I mean, my belief is that it makes it a really, really, really powerful tool to kind of replace a lot of the traditional kind of market research techniques that our industry, at least if you're in comms or marketing or advertising, has been relying on for the last 80, 90 years. I think it also kind of changes the way that you think about social data in a huge way. I think traditionally you think, okay, I'm going to purchase a subscription to something like Sysomos or maybe might be some other monitoring tool, and you're like, okay, well I'm going to basically mine influencer and sort of conversational insights that it will help me with my engagement strategy, so I can target the right influencers online, so I can optimize my social content to make sure that people are liking my posts more often. Might help me actually serve up the right ads to the right people. It's going to help me with customer service. Might actually reduce costs there. And then, after that, you come up with your typical social media scorecard where you look at how many Twitter followers you've grown in the last month. I mean, like everybody's guilty. We all probably do that in some form or another. I think that's that's obviously a really key way of using social data. But because it's, basically, it's such, it's such a great kind of lens into the lives of consumers. I really think that you can be using it for a really, really wide range of things far outside of social media, right? So. Usually you would just go from doing social media kind of intelligence gathering and just go straight to engagement strategy. But I think that social media data can also help you with things like what product should I be making in the first place? What should my distribution channels look like? Who should I be partnering with? I think on the brand side, I mean, there's some examples here where social media data is not just helping with your digital brand, it's helping just with your brand identity in the first place, just overall, both online and offline. So I think it's, again, really, really powerful stuff. So I'm going to use I'm just going to provide some case studies. Well, actually, maybe I should stop for a second and see if anybody has any questions. I know I've been talking pretty quickly. So the question was whether or not I think there's any possibility that social media data will potentially either augment or replace brand health tracking studies. And it's a really good question because I know, like Interbrand, for example, when they're doing brand valuation studies, they ask very, very specific questions to customers online that I don't know. It's very conversational, and but they basically try to figure out what would the brand be worth if it didn't have its logo and its identity, or how much would a company be worth, without it. So how much would Coca-Cola be worth if it was a generic brand? That's essentially what a lot of these studies are doing. I'd really have to think about it, but I do think if you were to find that like Interbrand rankings, for example, correlated with some sort of business outcome no better than social media data, I think you could start to make a case that, social media data is giving us that signal that we need in an equally effective way. But you would have to kind of test it, I think, across a bunch of brands. Any other questions? Or, yeah.
Quick question. The stats you showed were very potentially eye-opening in a sense. 50% of the United States population is engaged in social in some form or another, making it statistically valid. You have to tell this to a lot of people. Is it surprising and impactful when you say it still today, or are people like, yeah, that's information I already knew?
I think that the idea that social media research or analytics could replace survey data was really popular when in like 2007 and 2008. I think that probably Sysomos at the time was probably marketing that idea. I know that Radian 6 folks were. I think that a lot of agencies were. I don't think anybody was buying it, because if you look at those stats, it kind of wasn't representative. There really weren't a lot of people 65 and older. So I think the idea just kind of went into decay, and I think people just kind of stopped. I think that the quality of the analytics got so great, and I think that people started focusing so much on social media marketing that they kind of forgot that this social media data stuff is actually useful for other stuff in the first place. So I think it was an idea that was really big maybe 5-6 years ago, but kind of went into a hibernation a little bit. But now the stats are clearly showing, yeah, it's really, really representative. And there's, if you look at like Facebook, it almost seems like if you're a user, you're seeing way more adults and sort of, my parents use Facebook way more than I do, and way more than I think that, teenagers are using it. So it is becoming much more representative when you look across channels. And I think that is kind of surprising to people. I think people just kind of forgot that that was even something of concern. Is that sort of your experience as well?
Yeah. Very much so. I think that people think of it still as a niche thing, not completely evident that this is a valid source of data statistically. And I think that data was overwhelming to the point that it was like, the argument's dead at a certain point. If you've got 50% sampling, that's massive.
Yeah, unless you want to sample people that don't have mobile phones or computers, it's going to be pretty representative. And it's the same kind of thing. Like I think when phones became a common use for surveying people, when Gallup started using phone surveys back in the probably in the 40s or maybe early 50s, that was considered really crazy. You can't do that. Not everybody has a phone, but clearly that became kind of like a null argument. Here's an example of actually, I really like this. This is an example of actually using social data to completely replace traditional customer segmentation models, where you would essentially do a bunch of focus groups, qualitative research, and surveys. It would take maybe 6 months to a year, maybe $500,000. We did this for a movie studio in about 3 weeks, just using social data. You can imagine a fraction of the cost it would usually take. So essentially what we do in these cases is we go and find all the people that are actually talking about or following the film. This is what we did in this case. And then we identified all of their, in this case, we've done this with Facebook and Twitter, but in this case we just did this with Twitter because the nature of the audience. And we scraped every other single Twitter handle that they followed. So that came out to just a little under 50 million other Twitter handles. And then we did essentially what market research firms have been doing for decades. And I don't know how, I don't mean for this to go over people's heads or for people to be offended that I just said this would go over people's heads, but we did some factor analysis to basically cluster those interests together. So we basically found affinity groups of sort of handles that they were following. And then we kind of clustered the cases, we did k-means clustering to identify the 6 or 7 kind of core segments that really comprise the entire sort of fan audience. One of the things that we're able to do with this data, we actually have a normative data set of around 1 million sort of English-speaking Twitter users, so we can actually see where people are over and under-indexing in terms of their interests. And for those of you that have seen segmentation models, this looks exactly the same as something that you would get from a traditional market research segmentation company, but just using social data. And what we were able to show, some of it wasn't surprising. This is just one set of interests around entertainment. The people that liked this film also were way more likely to like Harry Potter, Star Trek, Doctor Who, Joss Whedon's, or people that actually have starred in Joss Whedon films, and people in the Vampire Diaries. And the key thing is that it's not just these people like one handle, they like dozens of handles here, right? So you can actually see for Harry Potter, it's not like there's a Harry Potter handle they're following all the actors and actresses that have been in the film. So the great thing about using this kind of methodology, I think the one advantage it has over using survey and qualitative-based research is that when you find the affinities that these people have, you can actually know who the influencers are already, right? It's just influencer marketing, it just kind of falls right into your lap. The other really cool thing you can do with this is actually come up with these segments. So you can kind of cluster all the affinities and the demographics together to kind of come up with groups. And again, exactly like you would get from doing 6 months of qualitative research, only we're doing it in a couple of weeks. We found one of the largest segments was something called pop culture geeks. This is actually a largely female audience that really likes pop music and fashion and so on, but they also kind of have a soft spot for Doctor Who. Which is kind of an interesting group. And so it's from a direct marketing perspective, from a paid media perspective, from an influencer outreach perspective, it just gives a really, really clear roadmap for how the marketing team for this film can kind of go to market. Another really interesting segment we found was something we call sci-fi fantasy football. It's basically men who really like one kind of geeky TV show, but they also happen to like one form of sports, either the NFL, professional wrestling, which is a really funny one, NBA or soccer. So again, yeah, really powerful stuff. I think completely, in this case, replacing the kind of traditional market research that usually would have taken months and months and hundreds of thousands of dollars to do. So this is an example. This is an example of using social data for a complete rebrand of a wine brand. It's a brand called Bella Sera, and it's a wine that costs about $5 to $8, which is probably why most of you probably haven't heard of it. So just to kind of give a little bit of background, this was a wine brand that was losing market share really, really rapidly, and the company that owns the brand had no idea why. And they'd been doing a bunch of sort of brand health studies, and the brand health studies have been showing over and over again that they were doing really well. Like people were saying, I really like the way this wine tastes. I like the way that the label looks. It's a good value, all the kind of stuff that as a brand marketer you would want your audience to be saying. So they couldn't figure out why they were losing market share. So we were kind of challenged by the client to actually use social data to actually come up with an insight that they didn't already know. And so one of the first things we did is we went into social conversations about them and other Pinot Grigio competitors. And what we found was that although people were saying things like, yeah, this wine's a good value, it tastes really good, they weren't saying things like, this is a wine I would share with my friends, or this is a wine for people like me, or this is my favorite wine. They were saying that about other competitors, but never about them. So again, people seem to be liking kind of like the external characteristics of this wine, but they didn't feel any personal connection to it. It wasn't relevant to them and people like them. So what we did is we looked at all their marketing materials really quickly, and we were like, okay, well, we know that our client is actually, they have Giada De Laurentiis as a spokesperson. And Giada De Laurentiis in all of her radio spots were saying things like, drink Bella Sera, or drink, Bella Sera Pinot Grigio. And she was saying things like, it has like really floral scents or floral finishes and so on. It was a little bit pretentious, honestly. Even I thought it was a little pretentious, and I live in the Bay Area. But we started kind of going in, and we actually did an affinity analysis of the people that follow these brands. And what we found was that these people, the top things that they liked on Facebook and Twitter were, I think, Walmart, Jiffy Pop, Kraft Singles, Target was up there somewhere. It was not the audience that really is going to be talking a lot about like the long finish of a Pinot Grigio and the floral notes that it has, or really be thinking about wine as like a very special occasion thing that you drink when you're at your Italian villa. So based on those types of insights, I think again, completely social media based insights. I think we explained really clearly like where they'd kind of gone astray with their marketing to actually start to lose market share. Basically, they were just appearing really pretentious to an audience of theirs that liked the taste of the wine, but it wasn't a wine for people like them. So we did a complete rebrand, making the wine much more about everyday experiences and just enjoying kind of like having a Bella life is what we call it. So we kind of de-pretentiousize the wine just based entirely on social insights. And this was not a social media campaign at all. It was completely, we did change the website, but completely offline. I'd like to say that they actually got market share after this, but there was a huge crop failure the next year. So we have to wait till 2014 to know actually what kind of impact this had. One of the other things that we're doing that I think you can do if you actually start to make the assumption that social media data is kind of a replacement for traditional panel-based research is create sort of actually go out and find specific communities online and actually kind of create queryable databases. So this is something we're actually doing for a lot of our healthcare clients. We've identified about 20,000 physicians that are active in social media. We have a queryable data set, so whenever we want to know what they're thinking about things like the government shutdown, we can kind of go search those queries and kind of get a quick opinion poll based on what physicians are saying online. And when we've actually compared this to what our clients are saying with their traditional kind of survey methods, the results almost always line up identically. At least they're directionally close enough that you don't really need to be relying on surveys, which don't take incredibly long to carry out, but they can take a few days. We can just sort of get them insights in a few minutes. Another really, I think, powerful one, which again is kind of missing here. This is something, again, we do for this movie studio. What we've done is look at we have data around about 300 films where we've been tracking social media conversations around those films for about a year surrounding the film's release, both in theatrical and home entertainment. And what we're able to do by just supplementing sort of basic kind of technical variables that they're looking at, things like the production cost of the film, the genre, the box office success of the film, media spend, and so on. When we layer social on top of it, specifically superfan conversations, which we collect from Sysomos, we can actually better predict home entertainment sales than what their financial team has been doing for years. So we have this really, the accuracy is around like 91% for most genres. And what this means is that they are using this for marketing purposes, but the real key thing that the financial team is doing with this social media-based model is using it to optimize distribution. So they actually know in which markets how many hard copies of the film they need to be sending there. And again, using social media data for a completely non-social media based means. I'm just going to give one last case study here. This is an example. I just like this one because it's sort of a local one, and it also it's one of the first times I ever heard a client say, "You just told us something that took you 2 days to do that we just spent the last 6 months working on and came to the same conclusion about," which I always like to hear. But this was for an energy company, actually based out of Texas, but they have a sort of a solar energy campaign here in California, and they're really trying to target homeowners in Northern California and small business owners, and they're trying to basically just get them to adopt solar. And what we thought we would do, we were kind of like, okay, well, we need to figure out who this audience is and find them behaviorally on social media, because people never just self-report like, hey, I'm a small business owner and I'm interested in solar. Like, you have to kind of do indirect means. So what we did is we took all the people that were following the San Francisco 49ers handle, and in part because we knew that they were a big sponsor, so that they would be reaching this audience. And then we found all the people that were following Tesla, because Tesla is kind of green technology. The people that are following Tesla are likely to be kind of affluent, so they're likely to own their own homes. Maybe they own a business. We looked at the people that liked both, because we knew that was really probably our target audience. And then we did a social graphics analysis like the one I just described. We looked at all their affinities. And one of the interesting things we found was that, they like a lot of the stuff you would expect in Northern California. Like, they liked Michelin-starred restaurants. They kind of had an affinity for modern art. They obviously like sportscasters and sports because they like the 49ers. But they also like pop science and NASA and so on. And the big thing here that was really missing for us was that these people don't really like they're not following things like the Sierra Club. They're not really following any sort of like eco-conscious kind of handles or properties that you would expect. And when we kind of overlaid this with some conversational analytics we looked at, it became really clear to us that this audience that they're going after, they're adopting green tech not because they're trying to save the world. Maybe that's like a tertiary kind of interest to them. They're really doing this because they're adopting solar energy, and they're buying Teslas and sort of hybrid cars because it's cool, because it's essentially trendy. And that was something that, again, when we told this to them, they're like, wow, this is great. We literally just spent 6 months and hundreds of thousands of dollars to come up with that conclusion, and this literally took us 2 days to do. So I think another example of where you can use social data in really, really powerful ways to sort of understand a market, understanding what's influencing the market, kind of just bring life to consumers really, really quickly in a really, really efficient way. So I think I'm out of time. I think I'll wrap it up there. Well, thanks a lot, guys.